All right, I am so excited to introduce Paul Magid. And I just learned that his given name is actually Peretz David Magid. And Peretz, am I pronouncing it correctly? Peretz, and it's Hebrew.
The beloved story. So it's a little backwards from English, but Peretz means he who pushes through, or one who pushes through. David means beloved, and Magid means storyteller. So my parents gave me the name of beloved storyteller who pushes through. Pretty good.
I think you're living up to that name. Names are amazing. Yeah, so he is beloved storyteller who pushes through. A little bit about, would you prefer I call you Peretz or Paul? Okay, I want to honor that. So Peretz Magid is co-founder of the Flying Karamazov Brothers. Karamazov. And is that, what language is that from? That's Russian. Blackface. I like my blackface. And the new old time Chautauqua. Chautauqua. Ooh, I'm having some good lessons in language here. He's a writer, a juggler, musician, organizer, and historian. I heard that he's given such talks as this while juggling in the past. So if you ever do that next time, please let me know. Through Chautauqua, he's been working with Native nations since 1982. He specializes in the study of the history of and the laws derived from the doctrine of discovery. Some things that he wanted to share for this session is, the name of this session is called The Repudiation of the Doctrine of Discovery. The recent repudiation of the doctrine of discovery, the legal, theological basis for slavery, colonization based on the inferiority of humans, not white, Europeans, and Christian, by the Vatican, has shaken the foundations of the laws upon which it is based. This spoken word session will be an interactive discussion on what can be done to bring balance to all people and healing to the world. I say ashe, that's like so be it. Is there a way that you say that?
Well, we can say it in Ladino.
How do you, oh yeah, so I just learned that he also speaks Ladino, and Ladino, maybe you want to share a little bit of background before you go into the talk.
Well, yeah.
Okay, if you want, and then however that we can just say, yes, so be it, let it be.
Okay. So, I'm a Spanish Jew, and from the Seattle Sephardic community. We moved here about 120 years ago, trying to escape Turkish oppression at the time. And my family, just for a brief history of my family, because it actually pertains to what I'm talking about. So we left Sumer, or Ur, of the Chaldees, and went to what's now called the Israel, Palestine area. And then at about 500 BC, and various things happened, which you can read about in the Torah. And then at about 500 BC, my family hitched a ride with some Phoenicians and landed in Iberia. And we stayed there for about 2,000 years. And then the Catholics, which we'll talk about pretty soon, saw fit to boot us out from the land we had been in long before them. And we spent a couple of generations in Livorno in Italy, when the Catholics were fairly similar. So we took the invitation from the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire and moved to Turkey, where we stayed for about 400 years and lived in a fairly tolerant community for our people. And then right around World War I and during the Armenian genocide, we decided to leave Turkey because it was not good for us anymore and safe. And so we moved, strangely, to Seattle. because a couple of guys got jobs there and they didn't know any different. So anyway, so I was born in Seattle at the Virginia Mason Hospital, and raised by my grandparents. So that's why I speak Ladino. They didn't speak English very much. And Ladino is ancient Spanish, basically. And when we got kicked out, we kept speaking Spanish at home all the way up until now. So my daughters speak Spanish. They mostly speak modern Spanish. But anyway, so this talk is about how it is that we are sitting here right now on this fair's land, and how they got that way. And I usually begin these discussions with, there's two ways to look at land. One is you're part of it. You are an essential element of it, and you work with it and listen to it, and which is what most of the world has done throughout time. People, Homo sapiens in the world. The other is that you own it, and you can do with it as you please, and you have rights over it, and you can keep other people from being on it, etc., which is the U.S. model and the model of most European countries. And how did this come to pass? So just a brief little evolutionary quick study. What they're finding out now through basically archaeology and anthropology, and also a new scientific discipline called archaeogenetics, is that Homo sapiens were evolved, were an evolved self-domesticated creature, right? Which is to say, if you're interested in learning about any of this stuff, you can come up to me afterwards, and I can give you a number of books to read and things like that. But basically, humans are self-domesticated, much like dogs. Actually, dogs weren't domesticated by humans. They domesticated themselves to be around humans. Or if you know of bonobos and chimpanzees, bonobos also self-domesticated. And what does that mean? Usually it means that you choose your partners for non-aggression. So humans began choosing to not reproduce with aggressive males a long time ago. We're talking 300,000 years ago, even longer, because really the first humans were Homo erectus and hominids like that, and they realized in an evolutionary, they didn't of course realize in a self-realized way, but that it was an evolutionary strategy that by learning you could work in a cooperative fashion together, and that learning was really hampered by any kind of aggression and violence. So what self-domestication is basically if there's an aggressive male, that male was eliminated one way or another. And so over the many millions of years, Homo erectus started, was around 2.5 million years ago, and actually went into Europe that long ago. But the ones were descended from Homo sapiens, and there's lots of talk about, all hominids mated with each other. So we're a combination of everything. So it's not as cut and dry, and none of it is cut and dry, right? It's all lots of shades of everything. But basically we were a cooperative, peaceful organization as far as, our creaturehood is concerned. And yes, there was always conflict between groups and things like that, but there really wasn't war. And what they found out archaeologically recently is that there were many, after the Ice Age finished at about 11,700 years ago, pretty soon we started domesticating plants and animals. And that domestication happened worldwide, of course, not right all at the same time. It took over a few hundred years for the ideas to spread. And that's another thing that they're discovering, which is that people lived in isolated places, but ideas continue to spread because people continue to mate with each other and be with each other, and go from one village to another, and an idea could spread around the globe, including to the, what we call America or the Americas. Within a couple hundred years, you could have the idea of domesticating plants. What an incredible idea, especially since, the climate had changed to allow that. And but with agriculture, initially there was no sense of hierarchy. People lived in what's called egalitarian societies for the most part. Not that everybody did the same thing, not at all. But people lived and made decisions all working together, because if you just have one person doing it, you're suddenly in the world of the aggressive male, right? So about, and I'm making this very quick because I have a lot to cover. So about 5,000 years ago, in a place called the Pontic Steppes, which is just north of the Black Sea today, was a culture called Yamnaya culture, and they domesticated the horse, and soon thereafter discovered you could make metals from ore, and invented the battle axe and the sword. And with these two things, suddenly the aggressive male was let out of the genetic pocket he'd been put into, and these people stormed all over the world. And this is proven now, absolutely, by what's called archaeogenetics. So if you look at the genetics of, for instance, white Europeans, they are about more than half Yamnaya peoples, right? And we all speak, everyone in Europe, except for the Finns and the Hungarians and the Basques, all speak an Indo-European language, right? What is an Indo-European language? It comes from Proto-Indo-European. Who spoke Proto-Indo-European? The Yamnaya culture, right? So they came, and they basically, either through pandemic or through violence, eliminated most of the men of Europe and took their women, and that's who most of you are descended from, right? And that's why you speak English. And with that culture and that language, you get all the sense of property. There hadn't really been property before these guys, right? This is before Egypt. This is before Sumer. And of course, none of this developed overnight. They didn't wake up one day with horses and, battle axes. But once they had them, their culture began to develop. And once they took over most of, India, Iranians, Indo-European, Hindus, Indo-European, Sanskrit is Indo-European. All these languages you wouldn't think are connected. They're all come from the same mother language, and they're all filled with the culture of property, right? The idea of ownership. What was the first property? It wasn't land. It was women, right? Women suddenly could be a piece of property. And so I bring this up because it's pertinent to what's going to happen next historically. So let's move ahead to the birth of Christianity, because that's really so much a part of what's going on here. So, I'm Jewish, and I was pretty well, educated in Judaism. I read Torah, I know that stuff. And Hebrew is not an Indo-European language, right? It has nothing to do with it. In fact, if you try to learn Hebrew or Arabic, you're going to have nothing to hang on, right? Not like if you learn, Spanish or Russian or Italian. There's lots of cognates because we all share the same mother language. But Hebrew is completely different, as are many other languages. And when there was this guy named Yeshua during, after the Romans had invaded what was then known as, the provinces of Judea and Samaria, and what we would know is call Israel. They invaded, colonized it, and had a lot of people who were working for them that were Jews. It was a lot of turmoil as usual, and one of the people who came to try to free Israel from the Romans was this guy named Yeshua, who, believed he was a Messiah. Now, what is a Jewish Messiah? A Jewish Messiah is not somebody who's a God incarnate. For Jews, there can be no human that's a God incarnate. God, the big revolution of Judaism was that God is everywhere, and God is not male. God is female and male, right? The Shekhinah is the female aspect of God, right? So God. We have no images of God because God isn't a guy or a woman or any creature. It's the whole universe and the force of the universe. So, this guy Yeshua came along, and there were various other people who believed themselves to be messiahs at the same time. And he crossed got mixed up on the wrong side of the people who were collaborating with the Romans. They, wanted to get rid of him, as they did to many other people. They got rid of him. They crucified him. And his followers were all Jews. He was a Jew. The Last Supper, for instance, was Passover. That's what he was doing, right? And so he never thought of himself other than a Jew, and as a Jewish Messiah, he would never have thought of himself as a God incarnate. So then comes along this guy, St. Paul, and this is where the whole story changes, really. And this is why you're sitting here today. Because Paul came up with these crazy ideas. He was a Jew, but he was born in Tarsus, which was a very Hellenistic, Greek-centered city. And when he never met Jesus, never spoke with him, but he had a vision after he was on his way to persecute some Jews, because he was working for the collaborators in the temple, and came up with some really un-Jewish ideas, which was, one, you had to believe in Jesus or you're going to hell. Two, you were born evil, original sin, right? Three, you didn't have to be Jewish to be, in this new religion of followers of Jesus, which all the apostles of Yeshua were like, what? Of course you have to be Jewish, because we're a tribe, right? I'm an indigenous tribal member of the Jewish people. We're from a place, and every prayer we talk about is about that place, right? We talk about the seasons in that place. And most people don't know this. Even a lot of Jews don't know what they're saying when they're saying it. Anyway, so these sort of basic intolerances. Oh, and that the other thing he said was that Yeshua was actually the Son, the God incarnate of God, which is, no Jew would ever believe that. Nobody would ever believe that. So there was a number of, shall we say, arguments between the apostles and this guy Paul, whose name was Saul. And like my Christian name is Paul, which means small. And they just said, look, take your crazy ideas, go somewhere else. So he did. He went and started, converting people and building a hierarchy, and, with deacons and all this stuff, which is completely not in the Jewish realm of things. And for a long time, the Roman Empire was, persecuting Jews, but persecuting a lot the Christians, because they weren't really an approved religion at the time. And then I'm going to skip ahead here. In about 300 or so, a guy became a Caesar of the Roman Empire. The empire at that time was divided into a tetrarch. It was 4 different zones run by 2 Augusti and 2 Caesars. And so the Caesars were under the Augusti. Anyway, this guy's name was Constantine. Have you ever heard of the Emperor Constantine? So he decided he wanted to run the whole show, And he, of course, his sisters were married to various other Caesars and whatever. He, over a number of years, managed to kill all of them and all his in-laws, and later killed his wife and his son. He was a megalomaniac, killed thousands and thousands of people. His mother was a Christian, though, and he had this vision just before he killed his brother-in-law on the Milvian Bridge going over the Tiber River into Rome, that he saw a cross in the sky. Of course, he didn't mention this until the Council of Nicaea, and the cross, and in this, it said in Latin, "By this sign you shall persevere," or win, and vincere. And so he changed all the standards to put crosses on them. This is where the cross comes from. Before this, there was no cross in the Christian church, and managed to kill everybody, and that took up until 324. And then he had this brilliant, incredible idea, which is still working today. It's a juggernaut of an idea. He was, even though he was a bloody maniac, he was super smart. And the idea was, here's this intolerant religion, Christianity. It says you have to be this way or you're going to hell. You have to believe in Jesus or you're going to hell. That all people are born evil. I mean, it was this, and he realized what an incredible mechanism. If the state could control this intolerant religion and make everybody that, then there would be no end to the power, no end whatsoever. And so he called the Council of Nicaea in 325 and sat there on his throne with his sword on his lap and said, so what is this? He called all the Christian deacons and bishops and together and said, so what's this Christianity? And they said, well, there's this and there's that. There was a big Arian heresy at the time, which I won't go into, but it was about the substance of Jesus, which most Christian churches still have battles over. He said, I think it's this. And they all went, okay, because, of course, they knew he was going to chop off their heads if they didn't agree with him. And he and a couple of other guys wrote the Nicene Creed, which if you're a Christian, you've probably said many, many times. And it got changed a little bit in 381, but basically it's written by the emperor, the bloody emperor himself. And, it's basically your pledge of allegiance to this way of religion. And the Roman Empire became a Christian one-state religion. And the head of the empire, the emperor, and the pope of the, worked together to keep power amongst themselves at all times. And so it was all about controlling people. And basically, as one of my, I work with, I teach a lot of native law, and a friend of mine is a professor. He's a Macaw native out there in Northwest Washington. And he calls it the wimpy principle, basically. Like, you get a hamburger today, but, you pay tomorrow. You get heaven tomorrow. Basically, you're going to work and be a slave all your life. And, what you get is what's called reciprocity or recompense. You get heaven in the future. So this led to, once the Roman Empire collapsed, the church did not collapse and kept this idea. You probably heard of the Holy Roman Emperor. Have you guys ever heard of the Holy Roman Emperor? So the Romans were battling the Germans, right? The border of Rome was always at the Germanic border, in Northern Europe. And in fact, Constantine was born in Germany. So he knew these guys. And anyway, once it collapsed, mostly because of the Germanic invasions, the Germans became the Holy Roman Emperors, and they realized, even though they had been pagans, they realized that this Christianity thing was an incredible way to keep power. So they started converting, and so through the 500s and the 600s, the 700s, 800s, all these Teutonic kings would convert, and then they would convert all their subjects to Christianity, and they would kill all the Druids and all the people who were working for what was called the old religion, right? That was the first order of business, was kill all those people. And there's I have lots of documentation of the murders of the people of the old religions. Slowly, Europe got converted to Christianity, and also melded onto this was a sense of German superiority, the Germanic people's superiority. And this is all throughout Europe, right? So the Germans invaded, the Germans, they were Teutonic tribes that spoke a Germanic language. They invaded, Italy. Spain was taken over by the Visigoths, which is where the Spanish royal family today comes from, right? And this idea of them being, because they are directly related to Yamnaya culture, right? They didn't really change that much from the initial invasions 5,000 years earlier. So slowly this idea of blood and religion started melding together. And the first people that really felt this effect were, of course, the Jews, because what happened, according to, to the Christians, was that Christianity superseded the Jewish religion. It was the new Jewish religion, right? It's called supersessionism. And so Judaism was superseded by Christianity, and then Jews slowly became enemies of the state, right? Because they were in league with the devil, right? And in fact, then it became they were the spawn of the devil, and in fact were evil just by their blood. And so when the first Crusades happened, right? So I didn't talk about Islam, and we'll get into that, but we have so much to cover so quickly. But when the first Crusades happened in response to the Islamic invasions, which started, with the revelations to Muhammad in 610, two intolerant religions kind of met each other and head on. And so the popes called up, for all these Christians to go and take back the Holy Land. And the first order of business, though, was Jewish massacres. And so they started massacring Jews all the way along till they got to Jerusalem, where they massacred all the Jews and Muslims when they finally took Jerusalem for the first time. And this started this sort of weird racial spiral, which didn't and has not ended since then. But it got concretized in about the mid-1400s when a couple of things happened. One was that the Portuguese invented, through Henry the Navigator, who, by the way, was the first one to colonize North Africa when he took over Ceuta in 1415. But he wanted an ocean-going ship that could go anywhere. And he, with a bunch of scientists that he brought over to Portugal, invented the caravel, which was the first ocean-going European ship that could eventually carry cannon and project power almost anywhere. And their first order of business was to take over the slave trade that the Arabs had in Western Africa. And because Portugal, as well as the rest of Europe, had been decimated by the Black Plague, and so there were vast areas that were not being farmed. And so the nobles wanted to get the land worked, and what could be better than have slaves do it, who you don't have to pay anything. So they needed a justification, though, because they were very Catholic, and they needed a justification for going and basically, kicking ass in Western Africa. And so they wrote to the Pope, at that time, Pope Nicholas V, who wrote them what was later to be called the Doctrine of Discovery, which came out in 1452. And I'll read to you some of that so you can hear with your own ears what this stuff says. Because the United States at this time still has on the books laws that justify this, right? This is the justification for our seizure of land in the United States. So it's called Dum Diversus Until Different, June 18th, 1452. We weighing all and singular the premises with due meditation, and noting that since we had formerly by other letters of ours granted, among other things, free and ample faculty to the aforesaid King Alfonso, that was the king of Portugal at the time, to invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens and pagans whatsoever, and other enemies of Christ wheresoever placed, and the kingdoms, dukedoms, principalities, dominions, possessions, and all movable and immovable goods whatsoever held and possessed by them, and to reduce their persons to perpetual slavery, and to apply and appropriate to himself and his successors the kingdoms, dukedoms, counties, principalities, dominions, possessions, and goods, and to convert them to his and their use and profit by having secured the said faculty, the said King Alfonso, or by his authority, the aforesaid Infante, justly and lawfully has acquired and possessed and doth possess these islands, lands, harbors, and seas, and they do of right belong and pertain to the said King Alfonso and his successors. Right? And which can be reduced to a very couple of easy sentences, which is to say, better to be a Christian and a slave than a heathen and free, which was written in 1444. Right? So you get recompense, you get reciprocity for being a slave for the rest of your life and all your children's lives and all their children's lives. You get to go to heaven. That's it. Right? You lose everything you own. The moment they what's called discovery, what we call discovery, didn't mean they didn't know it was there. They discovered it before some other European monarch discovered it, right? So when they did the mumbo jumbo, which various countries did in various ways, when they planted the flag and, the Bible and the standard and the sword, and said the mumbo jumbo, suddenly the rights of all the people who lived there disappeared as if by magic. And they were now the slaves and property of the monarch who made the discovery. And so right after that was written, basically the Portuguese invaded West Africa and took over the slave trade and started the first colonizations of the world. And this is long before America was discovered, right? And the other European colonies went, wow, that's pretty amazing. You can actually do something like that. And so when Columbus thought he was sailing to India, came upon North America, Turtle Island, the islands just to the east of Hispaniola and places like that. He said the mumbo jumbo. Suddenly all those people lost, all the Caribs lost their property. It's hard to even talk about what they did to those people, but it was just genocide on first order. They were killing them left and right, cutting off their hands and trying to have them search for gold. There was hardly any gold on the island. They just thought, there's got to be gold. And it was just horrific. And there was some backlash to it by some of the priests, the Catholic priests. But essentially the cat was let out of the bag. The Pope, the next Pope, Borgia Pope, gave the next doctrine of discovery to between the King of Spain and King of Portugal to divide the world between them, right? And it's just turned out to be called the Treaty of Tordesillas, and the colonization of the Americas began, and the rest of the world, and so. The Brits seen, my God, there's some place over there. We gotta get in on this deal. So Henry VII, King Henry VII of England, hired a guy named Giovanni Caboto. Didn't speak a word of English. We know him as John Cabot. And Giovanni Caboto and his Venetian sailors, hired by the British government, went on a quick dash across the Atlantic, and in 2 weeks went down the coast of what we call the United States, and said and Canada, and said, this belongs to the King of England, this belongs to the King of England, mumbo jumbo, and went right back. He didn't even stay for a second. And suddenly it all became Great Britain. That was in 1497. And we all know, I don't need to go through the whole history of America and all that kind of stuff, which was horrific and terrible. But they started colonizing also, in India, in China, in everywhere around the planet. Basically, the Europeans started to colonized, which is the world we live in today. But to get to where we are here in this country, so we all know the story of America and how the British and then the Indians were fighting, and the Indians were fighting the French, and there was the French-Indian War of from 1756 to 1763, and the British decided after they had won Canada from the French. And this had been, by the way, it's known in the rest of the world. We call it the French-Indian War. The rest of the world is called the 7 Years' War. It was the first global conflict because they were fighting each other in their colonies, right? So this is the first time there was a global conflict, and this is where international law comes from, right? The Treaty of Paris of 1763 was the first time that what's called international law was recognized, right? So when we talk about international law today, we're talking about its birth was then, and it's all about European international law, right? And so anyway, in 1763, the British, because they had allied with a number of Native Americans, put down a border on just west of the Alleghenies, saying no white people are going to be allowed to colonize beyond the Alleghenies. But meanwhile, the people who were the Brits who had been living in America, many of them, the people who were the richest people, were land speculators. And who was the biggest land speculator of all of them? The richest man in America at the time. Richer than Trump. Who was he? Any guesses? George Washington. He was, if you look on the list of the 100 richest men ever in America, he's on that list. He didn't make it from his plantation and his slaves. He made it from land speculation because he'd been a surveyor during the French-Indian War, knew what all that stuff was, and people formed these companies like the Wabash, Illinois Company, just like today, with stocks and investors, and they would buy huge chunks of land from Indians who didn't know what the heck was going on, and then divide it up for settlers. But suddenly there was this barrier that the British government put in their way to making zillions of bucks. So the real reason that they started the Revolutionary War was not over taxation without representation. That was certainly a good slogan. But the real reason was because the people who were the richest people and had the most power in this country decided that they'd had enough of the British government telling them what to do about how they could take over Indian land. So anyway, the revolution happened. We know that. And suddenly, once the Americans had established their own government without a monarchy, there was huge confusion about who owned the land. Before, it all belonged to the crown. Every piece of land belonged to the crown. Whether you had title to it or not as an individual owner, it belonged to the crown in the end. And with the revolution, people were confused about who could you buy land from Indians, basically. And one of our first Supreme Court justices was a guy named Thomas, and Thomas Johnson, and he bought he was part of one of these conglomeration, it was called the Illinois Wabash Company, and he bought a huge chunk of what's now known as Illinois and Indiana from the Plankenshaw Indians in 1775. Years later, the government grants to a guy named McIntosh, a Scottish guy who had, immigrated, a huge tract of land, supposedly on the same piece of land that the Johnsons had bought their land and from the Indians. And so it went to the Supreme Court, and it's not certain as to whether this was all sort of set up just so they could actually put this into law. And the Supreme Court at that time was run by a guy named John Marshall, Chief Justice John Marshall, who I'm sure you've all heard of. And they took this case on, and in unanimous decision, they decided against the Johnsons, and that the upshot of it was, and I'm going to read to you from this so you can actually hear with your own ears what the law is today. decision stands as the reigning property law. Like my daughter, who goes to Duke, to law school at Duke, called me up like about 3 months ago and said, "Daddy, and we're learning about the doctrine of discovery and property law," because it is the foundation of everything every piece of property you might own comes from out of this. So the upshot of it was that the crown land passes to the federal government. The federal government owns all land at all times. Even though you might have title to it, it can do whatever it wants to do with that land, right? Because it went from being crown to federal property, and that Indians have no right to the land because they're an inferior people. They only have the right to an occupation of the land, and they are forever wards of the state, right? And so right after this decision, which was in 1823 and had its 200th anniversary on February 28th this year, and we had a big reading among people who care about this, of the actual document itself, which I suggest everybody read, because it is foundational. Like, even if you don't care about Indians at all, it's your property rights, and it's all in this. So anyway, right after that was decided in 1823, what was the next thing they came up with? Now they had the rules. They came up with the Office of Indian Affairs, which later became the Bureau of Indian Affairs. At that time, it was under the War Department, and their first idea was removal, right? To remove all Indians out of white settled property west of the Mississippi, which is what led to, which I'm sure many of you know, the Trail of Tears. But it wasn't only just Indians from the southeast, it was Indians from the northeast, like the Oneida Indians and people like that, all got moved west of the Mississippi. And but then, of course, white people wanted things west of the Mississippi, land speculators and all that sort of thing. And so they came up with the idea of reservations, right? To basically incarcerate Indians and not allow them off the reservations until very recently. Like I'm with the Chautauqua, right? So I'm one of the founding members of the New Old Time Chautauqua, and we work a lot with Native Americans and also Canadians, First Nations in Canada. And we were just in a Blackfoot Indian nation called the Piikani in Alberta, and we were talking with one of our sort of spiritual people, a medicine woman named Dyla, and she was talking about how when she was, a younger woman, not a kid, a younger woman, in order to get off the reservation, she had to sign a permission slip, right? And then she had to be back before nightfall, right? This is not that long ago. So anyway, that was in 1851. They decided to start doing reservations. But let me read to you now a little bit from the actual decision called Johnson versus McIntosh, 1823. Keep that name in your mind and look it up. Find this document. It's easy to find because all law schools teach it, right? But I'll just read to you a little bit of what it has to say. And this has never been rescinded. This has never been changed. The last time it came up to the Supreme Court was 2005. It was the city of Sherrill versus the Oneida Indian Nation. Like I said, the Oneidas have been moved west of the Mississippi, and they started buying land back in where they lived in the early 2000s. They bought several thousand acres, and then the state of New York and the city of Sherrill said, "Hey, taxes, please." And they said, "No. We don't pay taxes to the state. We're under federal, the federal law." They said, "No, you're not. You haven't owned this land in 200 years." Anyway, the Indians lost, of course, and the person who wrote the opinion against the Indians was, any guesses? Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Why? Because this is what's called settled law, right? This is stuff you can't talk about, even though Roe versus Wade got overturned. This is like the most settled of settled law because you cannot talk about it because it doesn't make any sense. You have to have people be inferior in order for it to be something that makes sense. And I'll read that to you now. But anyway, so the last time it came up again, it was in 2005, and it completely got shut down. So, Mr. Chief Justice Marshall delivered the opinion of the court. The plaintiffs in this cause claim the land in their declaration mentioned under two grants purporting to be made, first in 1773 and the last in 1775, by the chiefs of certain Indian tribes constituting the Illinois and the Plankenshaw nations, and the question is whether this title can be recognized in the courts of the states, right? The people who bought the land from those Indians. The facts are as stated in the case agreed, show the authority of the chiefs who executed this conveyance so far as it could be given by their own people, and likewise show that the particular tribes for whom these chiefs acted were in rightful possession of the land they sold. The inquiry, therefore, is in great measure confined to the power of Indians to give and of private individuals to receive a title which can be sustained in the courts of this country. As the right of the society to prescribe those rules by which property may be acquired and preserved is not and cannot be drawn into question, right? As the title to lands especially is and must be admitted to depend entirely on the law of the nation in which they lie, it will be necessary in pursuing this inquiry to examine not singly those principles of abstract justice which the Creator of all things has impressed on the mind of his creature man, and which are admitted to regulate in a great degree the rights of civilized nations, whose perfect independence, right? That means civilized nations can do whatever they want. Perfect independence is not acknowledged, but those principles also which our own government has adopted in the particular case and given as the rule of our decision. On the discovery of this immense continent, the great nations of Europe were eager to appropriate to themselves so much of it as they could respectively acquire. Its vast extent offered an ample field to the ambition and enterprise of all, and the character and religion of its inhabitants afforded an apology for considering them as a people over whom the superior genius of Europe might claim an ascendancy. Right? This is our law. This is our law. Right now, you are members of the society that actually proclaims this. The potentates of the old world found no difficulty in convincing themselves that they made ample compensation to the inhabitants of the new by bestowing on them civilization and Christianity in exchange for unlimited independence, the independence of the Europeans, right? You get that? They get recompense. They get hamburgers in heaven, right? That's what they get for losing everything, their language, their land, their families, everything. But as they were all in pursuit of nearly the same object, it was necessary, in order to avoid conflicting settlements and consequent war with each other, the European nations, to establish a principle which all should acknowledge as the law by which the right of acquisition, the right of discovery, which they all asserted should be regulated as between themselves. This principle was that discovery gave title to the government by whose subjects or by whose authority it was made against all other European governments, which title might be consummated by possession. So I'm going to skip ahead here. I mean, it goes on and on and on, but I'm going to read another important part. Okay, I'm going to read one tiny little thing, and then, or maybe I don't have time for that. I probably don't. It's all right. You guys get the gist of it. But the only other thing I do want to say is that on March 30th this year, the Pope repudiated the doctrine of discovery finally. He did not rescind it. It's still Vatican law. That papal bull I read to you is still the law. But he repudiated it. He said, we really didn't have anything to do with it. It was all those other people. But it was repudiated, and here in America, there's hardly been a peep about it. In Canada, the Indians there are really up in arms about, we have to change this. And the other thing I'll just say is that slavery also came out of commercial slavery, as we know in America and elsewhere, came out of the doctrine of discovery. So it's not just the Indians. It's anyone else who was enslaved by this process. All right, so questions?
Did I hear a question?
how do we get out of this mess?
Well, first of all, please tell everybody you know about it and start learning it yourself, because you are governed by the laws, right? A law is a magic spell by which people who have weapons can control you, right? And so you have to know what these laws are, because they will come at you if you violate them, right? Which started thousands of years ago. So first of all is information. Get the information and start telling your friends about it, having them. I mean, it's just there in black and white. It's not like something that's hidden, other than nobody knows about it because they don't want to talk about it. Not taught in history classes, but it is the law. You can look anywhere. I'm not kidding. This is the law. Secondly, I think that people have to start thinking about how they want to live. As you know, there's 8 billion of us now, but we're hardwired to live in smaller communities, right? Where we know people, we have familial ties, but also friendship ties. But people, what they've discovered in archaeology is that people really were not evil and did not fight each other all the time. Most of the time, people of all different tribes would get together and have huge celebrations like this. This is like normal. This is what normal Homo sapiens do all the time. And they would come from wherever. Like, I came from Port Townsend and come here and meet other people, and then they'd get married to, switch tribes. I mean, that's what people do. So we have to figure out a modern way of replicating what our bodies are telling us and our brains are telling us. That's how we work. That's how we learn. We learn when we're having fun and we're hanging out with people that we love and we're doing something that's important and involves survival. But survival doesn't mean here's a fun statistic. The average hunter-gatherer person that they've done studies on, you know how much they work every day to make their living? 4 hours a day on average, because most of the time they're spending with their families, hanging out and having fun. And if you're actually paying attention to the world, you aren't going to be starving very much, because the world will give to you. It's a beautiful place. So anyway, I'd say it's two things. One is know what you're dealing with, which is a horrible, horrible mess made by awful religion promulgated by a terrible emperor of Rome, which has taken over everything that we know of. And two, get back to the garden.
Okay, one last question. All right, thank you.
So, when you were talking about the Yamnaya people, they got horses and swords, and through that were able to take control of everything and so on. It felt a lot like a Pandora's box or a Nectar of the Gods kind of scenario of they found all this cool stuff and they were able to get more things with that. And it feels like nowadays we have even more tools of oppression or control that way. So I don't disagree that like getting information and compassion maybe for the people around us and wanting a better life is a good way to move away from that. I guess what I'm asking is, in the world where we have all this technology that we have that supports us to do all the things that we want to do, it doesn't seem like sustainable, but it also doesn't feel like we want to give up on that kind of stuff. So how would you imagine us finding a way to make this work without or with giving up everything that we have?
I mean, I don't have the solution for everything, obviously, but really you have to know what you're facing, and then we're really smart. Homo sapiens are incredibly, amazingly creative, and when they're working towards a purpose where it's connected to the earth, I mean, that's I think the main thing is you have to actually be connected to the land you're from, right? You have to be hearing it and listening to it. That's all my native friends all talk about, that we're disconnected. Like when your family, maybe 1,500 years ago, 1,600 years ago, was converted to Christianity, they killed all the people that had anything to do with the land, and they oppressed the people who converted, right, into serfs, or then later, peons of various kinds, right? And learning stops. When you are oppressed and all you're doing is trying to survive, learning stops. Humans, however, when they're free of that, which is like what most people who live in a hunter-gatherer society even today, they're mostly playing and having fun and learning all the time. That's what humans do. So I'm hoping, my prayer is that we're smart enough that we'll be able to have the things that we've been invented and come up with, but we have to mix that with what the earth needs. We have to listen to the earth, and we have to work together in smaller groups that then connect to bigger groups, which is what we all kind of do naturally anyway. Like this fair is an example of that. We see it all the time when we do Chautauqua. We just did a show somewhere in Montana, like in western Montana, full of Trumpy people, and we had a great time because in the end we're all just human beings, right? And they're just stuck in the Christian matrix of black and white, good and evil, and that is just not going to get anybody anywhere except where, unfortunately, this country is at right now, right? So we have to, start thinking about religion in a different way. We have to start having our daily life be the religion that we, look to, and realize, at least from my point of view, that we're part of a larger thing. We don't own it. We're part of it, and we have to start listening to that. I don't know what the exact solution is, but I know it's there and that it can be done, and the earth would support it. Okay.